Urban Faith, it is so good to be with you again. It is a joy and a pleasure to be with just an awesome star in person, someone who I've known for a long time, who is doing work as an Instagram influencer, as an author now, as a uh, homeschooling mother, just as an all-around awesome person, and that is Caroline Sumlin. And she has written a new book, We'll All Be Free. It is available wherever you get your books. And I'm so glad to talk to her about this book and this work in the anti-racist space and dismantling white supremacy, talking about self-worth. Caroline, it is just so good to be with you here today for Urban Faith. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I am very honored to be here.
Absolutely. And so my first question for you, Caroline, as I was reading through it, this is a important book. It deals with some deep and heavy topics. And just, I mean, you really laid out a case, you laid out so much information. And I really want to start with, why did you decide to write this book? I mean, you could have talked about it in a lot of different ways, and you do this work all the time. Why did you decide to write the book?
Because I knew it was needed, I knew it was necessary. Long story short, this is an approach to white supremacy that hasn't been taken before, at least as far as I've seen. I could be wrong. Of course, haven't read all the books in the world, but most of the most of the white supremacy books that I've read, which are all so important. We talk about how it affects us systemically. We're talking about how it affects us economically in so many different ways. Again, all important stuff. But I have yet to see someone before this book talk about how it impacts our self-worth. And when I learned how it was impacting my self-worth, I've been on a self-worth journey for as long as I can remember. And I know, we know each other personally, and I know you know that well. That's always been kind of a central theme in my life. And I never really would have, like even just 2 years ago, I would have never made that connection between self-worth and white supremacy. I thought that self-worth was a me problem. I
Mm-hmm.
thought white supremacy was strictly a systemic problem, like I mentioned, because it's typically what we hear about. It's typically what we're educated on. I should say not in school, but in other areas, in other
Yeah.
books, we're educated on the systemic impacts, but we're not, no one talks about how it impacts our mental health and how we see
Mm.
ourselves. And I would have never thought that. I just thought, well, this is a me problem because I can't live up to what I'm supposed to, and never would have made that connection to, well, what I'm supposed to live up to was actually rooted in white supremacy. So when I actually was doing my own research on white supremacy, just in order to educate myself and my community as we doing the work and dismantling, again, I wasn't making those two connections. And then honestly, I feel like it was the Lord who told me, like, look at this connection here. And I began to look at white supremacy's impacts in all the different arenas and industries in our society. And it was one of those light bulb moments for me. And I was like, that's it. That's the book. And now here we are.
Wow. And I just think that that's so true, that I certainly have never heard white supremacy talked about in these terms, dealing with self-worth. It's not something that people ever talk about outside of just hearing the little stories here and there of, oh, I got called the wrong name in class, or somebody said something racist to me. We don't hear about it, how it impacts us on a daily basis. And as I was going through, one of the things that really stood out to me was that this causes us to dig deep, right? To have some deeper conversations about how we view ourselves, about how we view one another. And I wanted to ask, especially because I think so many people want to avoid these conversations. They're tough, and you name that at the beginning. Why is it that you think it's important that we talk about stuff like this, that is weighty, that's heavy, that's real, and not just stick to light thing? Why can't we just talk about, my new Instagram cat, or, why is it that we deal with these really difficult and tough issues?
Not Instagram cat, but
Right, Instagram cat.
but I think we can see the impacts of not having the tough conversations on our society and how, I mean, that's just even taking white supremacy aside. When we talk about going to therapy, when we talk about dealing with mental health, we talk about trauma, we talk about those tough things, you know, one of the most basic ways that parents kind of sometimes explain emotions to children. Or I've seen this kind of trending on TikTok, and excuse what I'm about to say, but it just is what it is. But like emotions are like farts. Like if you hold them in, it hurts, but if you let them out, it feels good.
Wow.
So but that's a good way for kids to understand, like, oh, like, you have to, because kids, right, they let
Mhm.
out everything, right? They don't have
Yeah.
any inhibitions to keep things in, because they know this. Well, it feels good to let out the burp, the to pass gas, to cry, to get angry, to stomp our feet, right? They live, and then guess what happens? They feel better because they release that stuff. As
Mm,
adults, we are conditioned to keep things inside, to be ashamed of it. To be ashamed of our humanity. And then what happens? The anger happens, right? The crippling and debilitating mental health happens. I could go on, to name things. I mean, I even think the rise in gun violence, all of that is connected to the fact that we are not dealing with what's going on
mm,
inside, both individually but also systemically, and how the culture we have created has magnified, a people, a society of people that are walking around with a lot of anger, with a lot of hurt, with a lot of unworthiness that they don't realize is going on. And then we wonder why we see what we see in society. And I understand that people would also argue, well, having the conversations can also lead to, tougher things happening, or division, quote unquote. And I would argue back and say, well, the reason why we see division when we have these conversations is because we, again, have been conditioned to be defensive. We've been conditioned to ignore certain things. And as a result, we haven't been healthily taught how to handle those important conversations, and the traumatic things that happen to us, let alone the traumatic things that happen as a society. So that's honestly the pushback that we see, I think, is the result of the fact that we are just now starting to have these conversations, or at least some of us are pushing for that. And again, we're living in a society that isn't healthy. So of course we're going to see that, but that's all the more reason to keep going and to keep fighting and say, hey, we can get healthy. It takes work. No one goes to therapy and comes out smiling every day. Okay.
mm,
You're going to go to therapy
mhm.
and you're going to come out with tears. You're going to come out with anger. You may have to process some things that may feel uncomfortable at first, but then the cloud does start to lift, and the burden starts to lift off of your shoulders, and it does get better. So I do believe in pushing and continuing to have the conversation. I do believe that there will be, a positive ending, but sometimes the messy middle is just necessary.
I think that it just makes so much sense that we have to be able to get out some of these tough conversations in order for us to really deal with and not carry those burdens, right? It's a catharsis that you're talking about. And speaking of catharsis, one of the things that I really note about your book is you were so vulnerable with us. I feel like you really didn't hold back dealing with some tough moments, with talking about your own journey. And a lot of folks don't do that, especially when they're talking about heavy topics. Why was it important for you to be vulnerable as you shared your journey working through dealing with something so heavy as white supremacy?
I think a couple of reasons. First of all, I wanted to approach this book with humanity. That is my number one ultimate. I want people to feel seen. I want people to feel heard, and that's done through storytelling. That's done through relating. That's done through seeing I'm not alone. I am a human. These issues that I've been dealing with, I'm not the only one that has ever thought these thoughts or felt this way. Um, and I also wanted my readers to know that I was on the journey with them, that this was not something where I'm sitting on some sort of pedestal where I have uncovered this secret or have unlocked this treasure, and I've already done this work, and I've dismantled white supremacy in my life, and I never deal with this again. And now here you are. Now you do it too. Sometimes I think that can really distance ourselves from our readers. Yes, it's important to position yourself as an expert on something. Of course, I don't want my readers to think that I'm just slapping some information together, but at the same time, I think it's important for readers to know, hey, this person is human. I can relate to her. She's like me. Um, but also, I think that the storytelling is what illustrates everything that I'm talking about, right?
Mm,
It's one thing to present the information, which I do in the book, but it's another thing to show, hey, this is how this showed up for me. So this could be an example of how this shows up for you. It helps the readers to be able to think in a way that they may not have been able to think before about these topics, right?
mm,
So that's why I take you on my journeys in school. I take you on my journey, in the first time I got my hair straightened and and what that did to me. I take you on my journey with mental health. I take you on all of these different things that I've gone through to show and make those connections to help you be able to make those connections in your own life, because I think a lot of times it feels so distant, and especially when you're talking about white supremacy and you're tying it to self-worth, you're like, well, how does that even make sense? Like, I don't, again, there's that connection that people are like, that isn't white supremacy and self-worth, like that, that's two different things. So
Yeah.
being able to make that connection with my story, I think also just helps it make sense for a lot of people, in ways that if just the information, I think that wouldn't have been able to click as well.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. As you were talking about some of these tropes, again, like I feel like we've heard so many of these things in isolation, like the white beauty standard and talking about having to
Right.
fit that mold, or you've heard people talking about, the self-perception of laziness or inability to achieve intellectually, and like you deal with those things. But because you took us through the journey of you dealing with each of those things, and then I love that flip that you do so often where you're like, that may not be your story. Your story may be like this. It really invited us into those conversations in those moments in ways that did feel concrete. But you did spend a whole chapter talking about the history, right? And I thought that was really important. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about why it's important for us to know that history, because I feel like, especially now, it's not getting taught, or a lot of people don't know it, or they're getting it in pieces. Why is it important for us to know the history of white supremacy's construction, and its continued political and policy and law, and the ways that it plays out today? Why was it important to take all that information and show us how we got here in telling this story?
A lot of us don't realize that history is like a puzzle, right? And you put all the pieces together and you get this picture. It's the same way that even our bodies work, right? If you think about when we go to a doctor, there's a doctor for your heart, there's a doctor for your lungs, there's a doctor for your foot, but our body works, in connection. All of our body parts work in connection to each other. That's how history works too. And once again, we're taught about these things very isolated, very compartmental. This particular thing happened. It has nothing to do with what happened 20 years later. Pure coincidence. If we even get to what happened 20 years later, and even if we even tell it truthfully, right? So the reason why I wanted to make sure that I illustrated that arc and that construction of white supremacy as a whole, dating all the way back to the very beginning of the racist ideas of whiteness being superior, was for us to really be able to understand just how deep this stuff goes and just how connected our ideas that we have today are rooted back to those very original ideas, because they did not, the way our society has been constructed over time, again, that was not in isolation. These were not isolated decades or isolated centuries as we like to think that they were. They
Yeah.
are all connected to our modern society today. The reason why we have the society we have, the culture we have, the industries that we have, are because they were began, a couple hundred, few, not couple, but a few hundred years ago, depending
Mhm.
on what point you look at. When I think about the point, the construction of modern society, somewhere in the 1400s is typically where I kind of begin in the book, very loosely, and then escalate from there. So yeah, I think it's just important to understand that, and number two, I will say, when you're digging up the root of something, and I say this in my book, you can't dig up the roots of something without finding it. And you also cannot really, in my opinion, you can't really solve a true problem without getting to the root of that problem. And I think that for everything, right? I think again, getting back to our bodies, something that I have dealt with, just personally, is a diagnosis of like autoimmune thyroid issues. So when I received that diagnosis and learned that there was things going on with my body, I didn't just look at my thyroid as an isolated issue. I had to think, well, what could have been the root cause of that, and kind of pedaling backwards and seeing all the way back to where this could have began in my life and why, and begin to work from the ground up. And I do believe that that is true with all of the problems that we face as people, individually and as a collective society. The more we dig to the beginning, to the origins, to the root, the better chances we have of actually making real change. And so far, we've only been trying to just kind of keep things extremely surface, like you said before, and
Yeah.
hope that we can just put a little band-aid on it and that might fix it, without actually getting to the root of where the wound is coming from. And then we don't understand why the wound keeps getting bigger, because no one's actually doing the healing for that wound.
Yeah. I think that Yeah, like I said, you did a fantastic job laying out that history in that course there. But one of the things that stuck out to me that happens later in the book that's so relevant for today is you had that chapter on hustle culture and how that's tied to white supremacy. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think that especially for our audience, for young adults, for folks who are still trying to figure out their careers, who are figuring out maybe going to college or trying to start out, early in, early adulthood, that like is everywhere, right? And I think it permeates so far beyond that. But can you talk a little bit about that tie between white supremacy and our hustle culture, feeling like we have to work to make it and to achieve and to be worth something? You talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I have an entire chapter on this because it is one of the biggest ways that white supremacy culture shows up in our daily lives. Our the entire idea of the American dream and the message that we are given as young children that if you just work hard enough and you just go to college and you'll be able to achieve this ideal life in America, you'll be able to buy a house, you'll be able to have your family, you'll be able to afford certain things, and you'll have that American dream. Although over time that American dream has become a lot more higher, a lot more narrower. It used to be that middle class, and now it's gone beyond that at this point because
Yeah.
again, with the white supremacy culture, the standard's always moving. But I I wanted to make sure that the readers were able to understand again the roots in that. So I wanted to take a look at, well, where does this idea come from where we have to achieve to be worthy, not only just achieve, but what the definition of achievement is, what the definition of success is, where did that come from? What is the definition of professionalism? Where does elitism come from? Where are all these different beliefs? Even the way that we look at intellect and how we score ourselves and all of these things have roots, they have backgrounds. Excuse me, even the economic decisions and how we've gotten to the point of having this free market and why, again, those decisions were being made. And I was able to tie all of that to, again, racist ideas, systemic racism, white supremacy, the idea of keeping this very specific, idealized version of success and of just. Supremacy, really, that the fact that whiteness, the idea in our country is that whiteness should always be the standard, should always be what rules the country, it should always be what leads the country, it should always be what's in charge. And so in order to be successful, you have to assimilate to that, and that comes from, again, decisions that were being made based on ensuring that there was a racial hierarchy, ensuring that certain people of color, certain groups of color, namely Black, Indigenous people, and then, of course, growing into our entire BIPOC population, stays at the bottom of a racial hierarchy, and doing so and mixing that racial hierarchy with the class hierarchy and making sure that they both go hand in hand. And again, creating these standards in education, these standards in professionalism, these standards in our careers to ensure that that hierarchy always maintains. And if you were to in it, now I'll move to a sort of a kind of class and professional hierarchy, even though primarily they're all connected to race overall. If you happen to be a person of color and you happen to kind of ascend higher than what the status quo says that you're supposed to be as a person of color, well, you had to assimilate quite a bit, and you had to make sure that you essentially connect yourself or tie yourself to whiteness in order to get there. And then if you happen to be a white person, there still is the fact of the matter is the standards of whiteness are also very inhuman. They go against our natural rhythms and the Eurocentric, white-centric way of thinking. We've been conditioned to believe that going against our human rhythms, being very industrial, being very the work on the clock 24/7, all those things kind of tying back to, again, the plantation and then the industrial revolutions, all those things kind of tying to where we are now. Well, we're conditioned to think that that's like normal, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not. So even the way that we have constructed a society to ensure that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are at the bottom, it still affects everybody because now everyone is tied to this hustle mentality, this work around the clock mentality, in order to make something of yourself, in order to prove yourself worthy, in order to prove yourself to be really more white so to
Yeah.
speak,
Yeah.
so that America, and the Western world as a whole approves of you. I mean, there's I could go on and on and on, which is why I wrote the book. But I hope that I hope that answers the question, because it's just so much to it. But the book will help kind of tie, from the plantation and the construction of capitalism from the plantation all the way to today. It kind of helps to draw those connections.
Yeah, I think it does, and again, it's one of the reasons why the book is doing a lot of work and it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. Just to spare our time, a question is second to last question that I'll ask you is, what advice would you give to the young girl, the young person who's trying to find their self-worth in this culture that's telling them that they're not as valuable? What advice would you give? And I try to like to ask that to all the authors and folks I interview. What advice would you give to the next young person?
To understand that the standards that you are being told you have to measure up to were constructed for a reason, and they were constructed not because of who you are, but of maintaining that hierarchy of whiteness. So to understand that it's really not you. Like, if you think you're constantly swimming upstream and you're working against a current and you just can't figure out quite what is wrong with me? Why am I always exhausted? Why am I always trying to measure up to something? Why am I always looking in the mirror and saying something is wrong with me? It is because you're being fed these messages left and right from every corner of society to try to tell you, hey, you're not worthy, so you can spend more money, so you can keep trying harder, so you can keep assimilating, so that white supremacy can continue to be maintained. And it's not you, it's them. And of course, you have to still live in this world. I wish we could just take a remote and just kind of turn it off, but
Um,
unfortunately, that doesn't work that way. But I think just knowing where it comes from and knowing that you have the ability to say no to believing those things and choosing a different route in how you approach life, I think is extremely freeing. And I think, again, I think the knowing the roots of it, even if you still have to play the game a little bit, because everyone's gonna have to play the game a little bit, especially in the workplace. I'm not saying that that's you just go tomorrow and start just doing things that differently, because you might lose your job. But I'm not saying that. But I'm saying at least you know the roots of something, and you can say, okay, I know that it's not me. I know that society is set up like this, and I don't have to measure my worth against this.
that's that's so helpful, and I think freeing. Again, we'll all be free. The last question that I have for you, because this is we're urban faith, is what message would you give to the church about confronting white supremacy, especially beyond protest and the hashtags? You do come at this from a different angle. And I think so often we think that marching in the street when another black person is killed, right? That's white supremacy. That's the thing we need to stop. But it's so much more and so much deeper. And it touches the church, right? It's in the church. And you name that and deal with that some in the book. What message would you give for the church about how to confront white supremacy?
Stop being afraid to talk about it, stop being afraid to have the meetings about it, and looking at how you are perpetuating white supremacy in your congregations. This is not something to be afraid of. This is not something that is against Jesus. This is something that Jesus, I believe, would be for dismantling any system that oppresses anybody else. So this is the work of Jesus, and it doesn't have to be simply marching in the streets when another black person is killed or there's another racist injustice that we see. That's important, but it is perpetuated in our boardrooms. It's perpetuated within leadership, and it's perpetuated with misogyny. It's perpetuated when you refuse to play any other worship songs in your church besides a certain group that doesn't have any people of color in it. Let's be real. And then
Yeah.
you dismiss somebody that wants something else, because that's not the only way to worship. There
Yeah.
are simple ways that white supremacy is perpetuated, and they all need to be talked about and confronted, so that every single human being that walks through your church doors feels like they are home and welcomed there, and don't have to be on edge because they're a person of color. But and not, again, not even just that, for everybody, because my book is We'll All Be Free, and I make it very clear that my book is written for everybody. White supremacy harms us all. It causes all of us to deal with feeling unworthy in some type of way. And so looking at how you're perpetuating it is the first step to dismantling it. And it's not a conversation to be scared of. It's not work to be scared of. It's work that is freeing.
Mm, there it is. And I think that you've invited us into those important conversations. Caroline, thank you so much for the time, for the work. We'll All Be Free is available. You should go get this, check this out. There you go. It's been meaningful for me, and I'm so grateful to know you, to have read it, to be sharing in this work. Thank you so much for being with us, Caroline.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor. Again, thank you.
Absolutely.